It's time for early RTX 3090 Ti buyers to feel really bad because the short version of the review of the RTX 4090 is that we're seeing rasterization uplift at 4K anywhere between 40 and 75% versus a 3090 Ti. So a big jump there. And although NVIDIA isn't allowing anyone to review the partner model cards until tomorrow, the Founders Edition can be reviewed today. Thinking, of course, about EVGA recently saying that they felt like they were competing with NVIDIA. This kind of rings true there. Either way, the Founders Edition is in for testing. Rumors leading up to launch of this $1,600 card were largely centered around thermals and power, which are closely related. So we'll be looking at those in depth today with transient spikes in the scope for analysis, as well as the usual gaming and ray tracing performance tests. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and their Silent Wings 4 fans. The Silent Wings 4 fans market themselves as being useful on radiators, tower coolers, and cases alike. The fans have a 6-pole motor and use a fluid dynamic bearing, which helps with the noise profile and with longevity. The fans use anti-vibration mounts for reduced noise transfer to the case and have a rated lifespan of 300,000 hours. Learn more at the link in the description below. So first up, we captured too much data for this review. We're actually gonna run another video with pressure tests, some flatness testing of the cold plate. We'll be looking at frequency curves, noise and acoustics and more in a separate piece, but this one is already pretty detailed for power, thermals, and gaming. We have over 30 charts just for gaming in here, or about 30 anyway. And remember that as we ramp into this, the cost of alternatives currently is more important than the original MSRP of things like a 6950 XT or like a 3090 Ti. So just quickly glancing at Amazon as we're writing this review, we saw that an RTX 3080 today, new in box, costs about $700 to $740 on average in the US. The 3090 is about $980 or so right now, just on Amazon Quick Search. And the 3090 Ti is in the range of $1,100 to $1,300. The 4090 at $1,600, obviously very expensive. You're looking at a 60% increase in price over, say, a 3090 right now, today, new in box. And NVIDIA still and its partners have too many 30 series cards, so that's going to be true for at least a little while. So that NVIDIA is launching the RTX 4090 standalone without the 4080s with it should give everyone pause on pulling the trigger at least momentarily. The company is clearly desperate to dump RTX 30 inventory, so every play is a move to ensure that we don't end up with a market that's overloaded with both 40 series and 30 series jamming the channel. And the reason we're bringing that up is because they have two more cards, both called 4080, coming up in probably about November, and AMD also has RDNA 3 coming up shortly as well. So we'll want to see how close the 4080s fall to this and things like rasterization, because if you look at like the A750 versus the A770, they're so close, the 770 might as well not exist for most people. So that's all the sort of disclaimers out of the way. Now we can really get into the performance and talk about how this thing does, because genuinely, this is one of the largest performance uplifts we've seen generationally in many years, in multiple generations. 1080 Ti saw a huge jump similar to this, but upwards of 75% is a massive spike over the 3090 Ti. So there is real power behind this card. The power numbers that have been discussed, those are fueling something, and it is an increase in performance. Now it's time to look at it though, and we'll start with thermals. We are leading our review with thermal and power over here. Stone is working on setting up the transients right now, so he's doing some transient testing to see what the spikes look like and how bad they are. We'll come back to that. And then on my end, I've wired up the card with all of these little wires running out of it. These are thermocouples that we have attached to key components like MOSFETs, memory components, and we're also monitoring the GPU with software. And you can see all these cards here. We've done a lot of this type of testing in the past. So actually, I'll show you some of the other cards we've done this on. This is actually one of them that we're working on right now. That's an RK770. And we're actually keeping this shut for additional climate control so we can keep it flat for ambient. And for others, we have tested many of these on the GPU shelf here. So a lot of these have been wired in the past in much the same way, but our methods have improved now and we're using better hardware for the monitoring, and I'm excited to see what the results are. So let's get back in there. So we have, I think it's 6 thermocouples hooked up right now. We're monitoring ambient actively every second of the test. That's something we normally do. And what we're doing at the moment is this is our ambient thermocouple probe. It's up and away from any heat sources. This is how we do a lot of our testing. So it's a really steady 20.0 degrees Celsius plus or minus about 0.5. And then I've got a bunch of these wired up to memory specifically. And then these two are wired up to VRM MOSFETs. We're running Port Royal on loop at the moment, but that's not the only test I'm doing. And it's also a custom Port Royal loop. So we've increased the settings to load the GPU specifically in different areas. And all of this will go into the thermal charts. But to show you some context for what this actually takes to wire up, because it's a nightmare, let's go over to what I call the arts and crafts bench. So this is a huge project to wire up cards with thermocouples where I had some printouts from our teardown video so I could just keep track of where the thermal pads are and where everything goes. We have the exact pads, brand new clean, that NVIDIA used. So we have the supply of the pads, we have the supply of the phase change thermal interface material so that we're able to replace everything as needed as we do these tests with an exact like for like that NVIDIA is using. So enough of all the setup, let's get into some of the thermal charts. All right, so the first test is Port Royal as a workload with some modified settings on the graphics side, but full stock settings on the NVIDIA side. In this one, the GPU core seemed to follow a temperature target of 70 degrees Celsius. It fluctuated between 66 and 72, and the GPU hotspot temperature ran in the 80s. Also fine, but pushing it if you're in more of a hotbox case. The fan speed would increase to compensate, so your noise would be higher. For the memory modules that we manually probed, we mapped the thermocouples along the edge of the module that bordered the hottest components nearby. Memory module R2 held steady state at about 65 degrees Celsius. That's case temperature. So for actual internal silicon of the memory, it could be as much as about 10 degrees higher, according to research papers previously published within the thermocouple industry. Even at 75, that'd be acceptable. The bottom module along the PCIe slot ran in the low 60s, with memory L2 in the same area. As for the MOSFETs on the left and the right of the board, those were running in the upper 50s and the low 60s. Since FETs can take around 100 to 125 C on average without big problems, this is all completely acceptable. They're in good range here. We'll also plot our ambient line just to sort of be transparent and show you how controlled our lab is. You can also use this to follow the dips and see how they're associated. Here's the bar chart with two different test scenarios. Both of these were with auto fan settings. However, the fans spun at the same speed for each. It was 45.4% average for the blue line and 47.0 for the red line, which is within usual fluctuation for a fan curve. Furmark with stock settings put more load on the GPU and the board, which makes sense. And it ran hotter for the GPU core and memory. The other components impressively maintained the same temperature, like for the memory and for the VRM components, and that was due to good thermal balancing across the board. So the GPU temperature following that 66 to 70 degrees Celsius range, that indicates that it is the vBIOS or the firmware that NVIDIA has programmed being told to basically set the fans along a known curve to hit that temperature target. And that's completely acceptable as GPU temperature for silicon. The hotspot's getting a little warm. If you put it in a really bad poor airflow case, you will be on the higher side. It'll run louder, and the best solution is buy a better case. But some other types of designs may do better with that. For example, an AIO solution. Now, since NVIDIA talks such big game when going over the prototypes for this cooler, we went ham wiring it up for thermal testing. It took about 6 hours of wiring and validation work, plus 4 additional of testing. But we wanted to challenge everything that NVIDIA claimed. And from what we can see, thermally, this card is proving itself. If you look at the lines in that first line graph we plotted, you can see how tightly together all the memory modules and the FETs are for temperature, and that's scattered across the board. So when we wired this up, it wasn't all clustered in one spot. It was across the whole PCB. And that means there's good thermal load balancing across the PCB, and some of that comes from design changes this generation, like putting in blockers, those little north and south fins internally, that stop air recirculation, along with obviously the increase in fan size. That's a huge part of it. It has downsides like case fitment, but that's part of the thermal improvement. And then obviously the fin stack being as much surface area as it is. So purely speaking thermally, ignoring everything to do with value, with gaming performance, ray tracing performance, DLSS 3 marketing, and whatever other bullshit that gets talked about relating to this card when it launches, purely thermally speaking, the Founders Edition here seems to actually be well designed. That actually is critical, because that is abnormal. That's the first time we've ever said that about an AMD card or an NVIDIA card, and certainly we've never said that about an Intel card. And this one is actually able to compete with partners. So NVIDIA is now getting to a point where it is able to compete with partners, which is also scary, because it starts to look like maybe EVGA knew something and just got out at the right time, if their partner is going to be competing with them this well. So that's it for the thermals for now, and we'll come back to the A770 thermals later. Now we're gonna look at power transients, where Patrick Stone is setting up and testing the 4090 for transient spikes. And previously we saw something like 2.5x in transients for something like a 3090 Master from Gigabyte, and that could be potentially bad and knock your system offline. So I'll let Stone explain what it is transients are, what we're testing for.
Yeah, so when we talk about transient spikes, what we're looking for on the hardware level is current, and we want to see how much current is coming across these wires. And to get a baseline for this particular test, we're using FurMark, then we'll jump to video games as well. The transients on this card are going to be a little more interesting, because instead of having 3 cables to work with or 2 cables to work with, now we've got 4 cables to work with. And so we've got to jump around here and there to figure out which one's delivering the most current, and then we'll use that to capture our transient spikes. Right now, we're just looking at microseconds. We're looking for these frames of high microseconds, so we got it set on a 200 microsecond per division. And in FurMark, we're catching things that are like 600 microseconds. For power supply over current protection, you're really not worried about it until you get into like the millisecond territory. But you know, that's why we're testing things, to see if it gets there. So we'll see what happens on the 4090.
So as for what all that means for the end user, the reason we look at power transients is because if you get really bad transient spikes and you either have a low quality power supply or one that's just not quite up to the capacity needs to cover that spike, you can end up with the system shutting down while you're playing a game or something. So that's why we're looking at it. Let's get into the charts. We ultimately decided to clamp all 4 cables using 3 clamps, which is fine since the rated range of the clamps supports that division. We lose a marginal amount of accuracy in the low single-digit percentages, but nothing that'll actually affect the results. We divided the 4th cable's 12-volt lines evenly between the 3 clamps for this testing. Overall, in our testing, the power behavior seems well controlled. The maximum current being pulled by the card is consistently about 33 to 40% over the nominal power, which is 450 watts. Most critically, these zoomed in scope shots show a change in behavior. Looking at the millisecond level at most, we typically see spikes inside of 100 microseconds on cards. With the 4090, however, the graphs almost look inverted. The longest transient spike we observed was 1,110 microseconds, or about 1.1 milliseconds. That's long enough to potentially knock a borderline or lower end power supply offline, and much longer than we typically see. In Rainbow Six Siege and Doom, we saw approximately 500 microsecond long transients. Now, this is different from what we typically see, where this one, since the max spike we're seeing is about 40% over nominal, and for a longer period, it's contrary to the usual much shorter, much spikier, and way higher power spike, like with a 3090 Master from Gigabyte, where we saw spikes upwards of something like 2.5x or something like that. If memory serves, we have a video on it. So this is different, and rumors had indicated spikes upwards of 2.5 to 3x over nominal for the 4090 for this card. And we're not seeing that. We weren't able to reproduce it. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We only ran this for about 8 hours for transient testing, then we had to do all the other stuff. So someone might find something more interesting. But from what we've seen for 8 hours of work on different games and applications, it's completely acceptable for the transients so far. It's just that duration might kick more power supplies offline if they don't have the capacity to soak. Now, some of the rumors did come from power supply manufacturers, and it's possible and maybe likely that since they had early insight to what the card would require, NVIDIA probably provided them the feedback, hey, it's going to be 2.5, 3x transients. They freaked out, said, no way, we can't do it. And then maybe there was some design revision and rework there in the time since. Also, we know that the GPUs for the 4090 were on 3090 Ti PCBs, and the 3090 Ti PCB was a test platform for the 4090. Maybe it wasn't up to the task. We also noticed that initial small spikes led to the power delivery circuit balancing the load as time progressed, and it does so in a really unique way. We saw the highest load shifting from one cable to the next, effectively distributing the transient heat load as well across the individual cables. Whether this was total chance or part of the design, we're not sure. We'd have to do a lot more testing. But we do know that this cable, this adapter cable, is really important. So it does have the 4 sense pins in it. And one of the things that we observed was if you connect 3 of these, we tried getting rid of one to see what would happen, it will still boot. However, you'll lose the ability to boost the power target. So normally you could go from 100% to 133% max with all 4 connected. With only 3, it drops down to just 100%. With 2, we weren't able to get it to boot and post image to the screen. And that's because NVIDIA is actively sensing how many cables are connected to this adapter. So it is a smart adapter in that way. This isn't just a dumb plug them in and then it just pulls the power it wants to pull from whatever's connected. It knows what's on the other side. That's important. We noticed that the power connector responsible for the highest current draw across that varied from test to test, which is uncommon. Typically, we see a dominant connector, then a secondary and a tertiary and so forth. This one demonstrated behavior almost like a feedback loop that helps to regulate the card and its power draw. So you'll definitely want to use all 4 if you get one of these. And as for the aftermarket options, we haven't tested them yet. We don't know if it'll still pull the full power if you're only running 2, even though technically the cables can handle it, or what'll happen. That'll be a future thing. But there's a lot more power testing we could do here. For now, let's just look at a nominal load chart, and then if anyone discovers anything really unique on launch day, we'll continue to investigate it. But for now, transients of 33% to 40% seems to be about the norm. Now for the averaged power consumption. This shows the actual power utilization over longer periods. So rather than the transient spikes upwards of 630 watts, we're looking at sustained power. Tested in Firmark for a torture load, the RTX 4090 stock card pulls 496 watts on average. We observed 450 to 490 watts in some gaming scenarios, but closer to that 500 mark in Firmark. That aligns with the 3090 Ti results previously. And remember that this is just the card power, so slot plus PCIe cables. We don't measure the whole system in this. As for the 33% power increase for an overclock, the RTX 4090 pushes to... That's unfortunate. Let's move on to gaming benchmarks. In Total War Warhammer 3 at 4K and high settings, the RTX 4090 is entirely GPU bound, which is good for testing, and runs at 125 FPS average. That has it outdoing the RTX 3090 Ti by 59% and the RTX 3090 by 81%. The lows are also improved significantly on the 4090, however, they're mostly proportional to the average, so it's nothing special here. If you bought a 3090 Ti though for $2,000 early this year, it's probably feeling pretty bad right now. They don't normally launch them this close together. The 6950 XT trails both and the RTX 3080, but will do proportionally better at 1080p and 1440p. We've also got the 2080 Ti on here, where the 4090 outperforms it by an increase of 172%. These are some of the largest gains we've ever seen generationally. So regardless of price, that at least is impressive on its own. We'll talk about the value though in the conclusion. At 1440p, the 4090 isn't yet CPU bottlenecked, so it's still actually showing scaling here. The card maintains a 64% improvement over the 3090 Ti and an 83% improvement over the 3090, similar to the 4K results. The 236 FPS average result has it about 100 FPS or so over in average, over the 6950 XT from Sapphire, which is a 90% improvement. Finally, for the 1080p results, the 4090 gets cut down to a 54% lead over the 3090 Ti. That much of a swing downwards isn't because of architecture alone, but also again because we're starting to hit that CPU limitation this game. In F1 2022 at 4K, the 4090 ran at 230 FPS average and held a 70% lead over the 3090 Ti. That's similar to what we saw in Total Warhammer, although a bit better for the 4090 here. So it's shaping up to be the average of 60 to 70% right now for a rasterization lead. The boost over the 3090 non-Ti is a 100% jump or a doubling of frame rate performance, but the 6950 XT lands between the two in this game and cuts the 4090's lead down to 73% as compared to its 133 FPS average entry. Lows are proportionally scaled on the 3090 Ti, the 3090, and the 6950 XT. They're still good on the 4090, but they're not proportionally scaled with the average frame rate. This chart will show us frame time consistency. It's the most empirical way to look at the user experience, as it shows the frame-to-frame time required in milliseconds to render each of those frames, just shown as one point on the line. The RTX 4090 mostly clusters around 4 to 5 milliseconds, but regularly spikes to 9 milliseconds. These aren't noticeable to the player. Typically, we see that people observe 8 to 12 millisecond jumps as potential stutters, but they are enough to throw that 1% out of proportion that we saw earlier. There's a single spike to 26 milliseconds that is noticeable to the player as a slight hitch or stutter, but we'd normally have to see multiple of these in a test period to actually become concerned about them. For now, it's something to pay attention to as we iterate through the next charts. The 6950 XT plots just as kind of a baseline for another device. This one is mostly consistent throughout the test with fewer excursions, though it does have a few excursions of its own. Moving to 1440p now, the RTX 4090 is approaching the CPU bind, which is in the 290s for FPS average. That means we're CPU bound on and off throughout this test, but not for the entirety of it. The 4090 holds a 27% lead still over the 6950 XT, but that's cut down from 73% previously. Some of that is AMD gaining at these lower resolutions, but most of that is a CPU bind. We won't learn much new at 1080p other than a reminder that the 6950 XT and the 6900 XT have an advantage over the 3090 Ti at this resolution. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is up now. At 4K, the 4090 maintains a 70% lead over the RTX 3090 Ti. It's consistent with the previous results. The 6950 XT and the 3090 are both similarly ranked, and if you were on an RTX 2080 Ti previously, you'd see a 164% increase in frame rate moving to the 4090 Ti. Almost leaked a new card there. It's just called the 4090. It's not the Ti. Let's all move along before anybody from NVIDIA hears that. This is where we jump to a regular reminder that if you're happy with your computer today, there's no need to upgrade right now, even though something like this is shiny, new, and impressive. Because if you look at that chart we just saw, everything on there is in playable territory. You'll do just fine. The frame rates are getting ridiculous at this point with these types of cards until you enable features like RT. So it is something to really think about. Do you actually need to upgrade? And especially, do you need to go this high end if there's stuff like 3070s out there for cheaper now than they used to be? 1440p reduces the 4090 not TIs, which doesn't exist, lead over the 3090 Ti from 70% to 27%, a clear CPU cap. The 6950 XT also encroaches on the 4090, and it now outranks the 3090 Ti as well. As we're bound here, we'll move on, but the value is clearly dismal if you're playing under a constraint like this and buying a 4090. It just does not make any sense. Just to show it, since we have it, here's a 1080p chart. It's also bound, obviously, and everything above the 3080 mark is incomparable and useless because it's being limited by the CPU, but it gives you some perspective of where your limitations might lie. Rainbow Six Siege at 4K gives us an older DX11 title to look at, but one that's still popular. This game has the 4090 at 355 FPS average, leading the 3090 Ti by only about 47%, only there compared to the previous results. It's not spectacular for the price, considering the 3090 Ti is currently closer to like $900 to $1,000, and the 4090 outperforms the 6950 XT by 86% here at average FPS, which sets a mark to watch for lower resolutions. At 1440p, it's still not CPU bound. The 4090 leads the 3090 Ti by 41%, consistent with the 4K result previously. The gains in Rainbow Six Siege are just that much worse than in other games, which shows that the API and the game itself may dictate some of your scaling in a way that can wipe out most of the value of the 4090. And again, we won't spend much time on 1080p. It's CPU bound now. It did climb another 50 FPS first before hitting the CPU bind with these graphic settings, but it's bound nonetheless. The gap between the 6950 XT and the 3090 Ti has shrunken here, although the 3090 Ti carries better lows than the AMD hardware. Not that it is noticeable at this frame rate anyway, and if you want better value, you buy something further down the stack. Here's another game where the scaling isn't as impressive as those earlier 70% numbers. In Horizon Zero Dawn at 4K, we saw a limitation in scaling at 53% gain over the 3090 Ti, and we're not CPU bound. That's uncharacteristic of the earlier results. It's close, but it's just not quite there. 1440p shows us the limit at 180 FPS average, with the 6950 XT also bouncing off of that limit. The 6900 XT and the 3090 Ti are close enough that some frames are likely getting capped, but not all of them. So these are all basically the same. Clearly, you should not buy a 4090 if you're going to play in a scenario like this. It's a waste of money. 1080p is fully capped. Same thing, nothing new to see here. 4090 looks like it's actually doing worse than the 3090 in this one. In reality, it isn't. It's just that they're also limited, that we can't see scaling. They're tripping over their own frames as the CPU tries to keep up, and you end up with a stack that you can't differentiate. Final Fantasy at 4K is up now, and this one, maybe shockingly, we were still GPU bound. The game is so easy to run that we thought we might actually be totally CPU limited even at 4K, but it's still GPU targeted at high resolutions. The RTX 4090 ran at 214 FPS average, which positions it 75% ahead of the 3090 Ti's 122 FPS average. That's better scaling than we've seen elsewhere, maybe partly thanks to DX11. NVIDIA has always done disproportionately well on DX11 since that API requires more driver work to run well. The lead over the 6950 XT is 88%, with the 3090 getting doubled cleanly by the 4090. At 1440p, we're hitting the CPU bind. The 4090 runs at 235 FPS average, which is functionally the same as the 220 result we had on the 3090 Ti, so there's no real difference here, and we'll skip 1080 this time since it's the same. We also ran GTA 5 at all three resolutions, but only 4K matters since the engine is capped at 187.5 FPS average. Makes basically everything the same. The RTX 4090 ran at the full cap here, dropping almost 0 frames. And you have to realize, we've been running this benchmark since 2015 now on GPUs. We've never seen a card hold basically the engine cap like this. The lead over the 3090 Ti is only 38%, so in that regard, it's not worth it. The value doesn't scale like in other games because we're artificially limited on the engine. The CPU isn't capped either, just to be clear. It's only Rage that's capped. And not mine, but like the name of the game engine. My Rage is uncapped. There's no cap.
No cap.
Okay.
No capping.
Now we get into the really complicated testing, which is ray tracing and DLSS or FSR or XeSS testing. And those three sets of initialisms are why this has gotten so complex. So not only do we have to test for just pure rasterization, we also need to test for ray tracing. But then, because features like DLSS are so prominent now, we have to enable those, and there's different ones for each vendor. So this has become a massive matrix of really messy tests to run. We've done our best to distill it down into a few sets of games to give you a wide picture performance. Let's take a look. We'll start with Control, which came back as one of the most played RT games when we polled our community, you all, recently on YouTube community posts. Cyberpunk was one of the other most popular. We'll test that too. Starting with 4K and without DLSS, the RTX 4090 ran at 76 FPS average here. That's with RT on now. The lows are spaced out extremely well on all of these devices, keeping strong rank thanks to the game engine and the build itself, from the developers that is. The 4090 outperforms the 3090 Ti by about 60% here, and the 3090 by a staggering 86%. The RTX 3080 is next in the list, with the 6950 XT at 31 FPS average, which allows the 4090 an improvement of about 144%. Intel didn't make the cut for this game, but it's in some of our other tests. At 1440p, the 4090 jumped to 148 FPS average, roughly doubling from its 4K frame rate previously. That has it 61% ahead of the RTX 3090 Ti, about the same as the 4K result. They're scaling in step, so the jump over the 6950 XT would scale in step as well, except for AMD's architectural advantage, where the improvement is reduced to 127% from the 144 previously. And now we're at 1080p. The 4090 had its lead reduced to 29% over the 3090 Ti, a clear mark of a bottleneck elsewhere in the system. Everything tested thus far is playable with these settings at 1080p, even without the support of DLSS or FSR, and there's just no benefit to a 4090 here that's meaningful at this resolution. F1 2022 is back now, this time with ray traced settings. Remember that this chart cannot be compared to the previous F1 charts. Those do not use RT settings. We get emails about this every time we publish reviews. There are RT charts and non-RT charts. They can't be compared. The ray tracing result at 4K has the 4090 running an incredible gap over the 3090 Ti, forming a depressing rift for pre-price drop buyers. The improvement is 75% over the 3090 Ti, which came out this year. The 3090 is next, and generationally against the non-Ti, the improvement is 105%. The closest AMD card is currently the 6950 XT at 31 FPS average. Intel's Arc makes an appearance here as well, but it's nearly fallen off the chart already at 17 FPS. 1440p, the 4090 leads the 3090 Ti at 70%. The lead against the 2080 Ti is 200%, and that card wasn't too dissimilar of a launch price at $1,200 when factoring in inflation over the last few years. Even ignoring inflation, we'd be at a 33% price increase for MSRP for the 4090 for a 70% RT performance jump, not that the 2080 Ti was ever on a recommended list anyway. Things matter less at 1080, so the 4090 is only 27% ahead of the 3090 Ti here. There's a loss of scaling. We have an increase in CPU workload as well with RT, and so we're seeing a CPU bind. Cyberpunk 2077 is up next, and this was one of the most played RT games in our community questionnaire that we posted recently. We used DLSS and FSR for this one, and Intel is using FSR at the moment instead of XeSS because it's not really ready. We're using the quality settings at equal resolution scaling, so in other words, at 4K, it's scaling up for 1440p. At 4K, the RTX 4090 ran at 79 FPS average with DLSS 2, the existing one. This is without DLSS 3 testing because that's basically an alpha or a beta, depending on how you look at it, and the Cyberpunk team isn't really ready with it either. So that has the 4090 again at about 76% ahead of the 3090 Ti. It's about 170% ahead of the 6950 XT, so NVIDIA's hardware and DLSS combination pushes it pretty far ahead. Intel's A770 technically is on the chart, but let's move on. At 1440p, it runs at 136 FPS average to the 3090 Ti's 80 FPS. That's with the ultra settings and DLSS for both. So the 3090 Ti ends up allowing the 4090 a big lead again. The 3090, though, the non-Ti, wasn't too far back from the Ti. At 1080p, we're hitting a CPU bind again from increased work on the CPU. The 4090 still holds a significant lead, but it's getting diminished here. Finally, here's Tomb Raider. This one has ray tracing enabled as well. We'll just flash through the results on the screen. You can pause if you're interested. This review's long enough as is, but the 4090 saw about the same percent scaling in the others, 75% over the 3090 Ti once again, at least until scaling got cut at 1080. Okay, so wrapping up then, first of all, DLSS 3 was a lot of marketing talk, and there was a good amount of bullshit in that presentation, the keynote, because kind of like RT, we're not really gonna see DLSS 3 truly hitting the market with this launch. There's some stuff out there, not a lot. It's also a lot of alpha and beta, and it doesn't work perfectly. So let's just factor that out right now and ignore it. Much like with the 20 series launch, you ignore RT. In most cases, we're seeing 40 to 75% gains over something like a 3090 Ti in 4K. Depends on the game. Some of them are less, like Total War Warhammer, but in a lot of them, we're seeing those higher values. Now, at lower resolutions, this is truly pointless. This is like, you can be on the best CPU, and if you're not playing at 4K or 1440 with a relatively high graphics quality game, you are going to be CPU bound. So that's where you need to know your use case. If you are not really pushing graphics quality and resolution, this is a waste of money for you. Plain and simple, just like the Titans always have been as well. At 4K, that's where you start to see the actual gains, and then obviously with features like ray tracing. So whether this is actually worth it, we have not really talked about that yet. This is an expensive card. It is functionally in that Titan class where historically you go, this isn't a gaming GPU. And that's true if you look at something like a 3090, a 3090 Ti. We've never said buy this one. We've always said grab the one lower down from it. So in those examples, the lower end stuff launched first. So like a 3080 or a 980, a 1080, stuff like that. Came out before these monster flagships did, like this one. NVIDIA switched it this time, and this came out first, which we think probably means if we had the data for a 4080 today, we'd probably be taking the same stance as previously, where we go save the money, buy the cheaper non-Titan, non-Ti class, 1080 Ti notwithstanding, that was a mistake they'll never make again, and move with one of those. So right now, we're not really comfortable making a full value judgment until we have the 4080. So we're kind of in that, let's all just wait and see. Be patient, see what happens with the 4080s and with RDNA 3, because that's going to be really interesting with multi-chip. But NVIDIA's in a strong spot with the architecture generationally. It's just the value comes into question when you launch only the absolute flagship, and traditionally that's not what you do as a company like NVIDIA. As for the thermal design, it is actually excellent. It's weird to say. Like we said earlier, Founders Edition cards, reference cards, we have never been in favor of the thermal design on those. NVIDIA really did kind of fix this one. It's massive as a result, but then so are the partner models. And that begins the interesting discussion of, can partners truly compete with a company that has infinite resources, as one of NVIDIA's thermal engineers recently said, to do things like fan simulations, when the partners are just sort of picking from the supply that's out there on the market. So that's going to be a really interesting fight to see. We won't actually know the answer to that until we get partner models in. Power. So the transients were not bad from what we saw. It's possible there's something hiding there that we didn't discover. Please keep us informed if you see something from someone. We'll look into it. But for now, we didn't see any transients that were concerning. The power consumption is high. It's 450 to 500 watts. And you're going to need to accommodate transients of at least 30 to 40%. for pretty long durations of 500 microseconds up to 1100 microseconds at 1.1 milliseconds. So that's abnormal. That's kind of new, is that duration of transients. So that's it for this one. We'll talk more about value once we can see more of the market shape up. But right now, keep in mind, the 30 series, which NVIDIA is happy to sell you as well, has come down in price, as have the 6000 series from AMD. Those are seriously worth considering at the moment, even if you buy it new in box and paying that slight premium over something used if you don't feel comfortable with the used market, and we don't blame you. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by grabbing things like our mod mats to build your PCs on, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help fund our reporting. Check back for more. We'll see you all next time.